You're welcome to LSW. I hope you've been sharing it. I hope you've been subscribing to it. I hope you've been taking it beyond confines, because this channel actually deals with rupturing confines. Now, let's continue with our dialogue on, doing cultural research, where we put literature and some other fields we called texting the last time, where we put them and where we are able, to make very fruitful academic delivery of them. Now, the last time we were talking about how the idea of culture has changed over time, that in those days, to put it very succinctly, in those days, culture used to be seen as a way, an imaginary of determining the group affiliation of people. It still happens today, but then when we talk about culture in the context of cultural studies, one, we don't look at it from the prism of cultural belonging, referring back to a past, a kind of originary past. We are rather interested in a present-day study of culture and the kinetics, the mechanisms, the several ways in which the fluidity of culture comes up. In other words, we actually look at culture in continuous production. We can put it this way, that in those days, the traditional way of looking at culture would have been to engage the diachronic study of culture. That is, looking at culture from a particular time frame that refers back to the past to what we can call a synchronic way of dealing with it. That should remind you of structuralism. Structuralism will rather want to look at the engagement of the science system in relation, to a synchronic moment of making arbitrary meanings of those signs. Now, cultural studies looks at the moment and how it is a dynamic field, a field in which subjectivity is preferred to group, tastes, where dialogues that we might have said were tabooed, things that wouldn't have come within purview in culture, are actually brought back. In other words, cultural studies seems to bring out those repressed identities that are rarely ever heard, the marginalized scapes of culture, to prominence, so that we are engaging a field that is so diverse and talks about the interconnectivities of discourses, of subjectivities, of belonging, in such a way that we keep redefining within cultures. We keep relating with dynamics that influence them. For example, there are ways in which a particular politics, within governance or party affiliation may affect the taste of certain members of the population of a nation state, and within that same population, we don't always have a kind of ways of defining them. People will have their own exceptions, their own deviances, but then it all goes within the idea of a stream of interrelations of several identities. And those identities can be influenced by a particular government policy, the taste of a particular brand in the private sector, for example, in the contemporary moment where communication has been absolutely revolutionized through the social media, through gadgets like phones and things that have to do with mobility and the like. You will find out that there is this way in which you keep seeing several forms of taste, negotiations and renegotiations. A brand of Coke, for example, that is brought within the public space, where the person branding it, or the person that you find within, the film that advertises that brand, where the film that is produced is characterized by a man that is showing strength because he drinks Coke, might be talking about the masculinity invested in drinking Coke. In other words, it might be interpreted as not just a drink, but a way of boosting your masculinity. It could also be a way in which it challenges some, racial fixities. Imagine that the person that is brought to advertise that Coca-Cola brand is African and the person is black and is doing it within an agrarian field where farmers are busy tilling the soil. You might say that kind of advertisement is not just talking about Coke as a diet, it's also talking about the popularity of Coke within the African margin. For example, it might be saying that it goes beyond identifying it as just something urban, something you find in cities. It can also be found in rural areas. It can also be found on the farm, not necessarily within the CEO's office where there is a boardroom meeting trying to determine the budget for the new year. Okay, that somehow Coke goes not only trans-racial, it also goes to a place where it problematizes the idea of it being an absolute modernist thing that is domiciled in the city. It is also somewhere else on the plantations. Now, having said that, we may also say that nowadays there is a breakage in how we identify sexuality, and that is also an area of cultural studies. We can say that somehow with that situation where heteronormativity, that is marriage of the opposite sexes, is now being contested by some voices that are rather privileging homonormativity, that is same-sex marriage or relationship, or you are looking at things that have to do with crossing the biology of particular sexes. For example, in the area of transsexualities, where people feel they have exhausted, so to speak, their facility, their usefulness as being male or female, they want to cross to the other sex through some medical compromise. You can say that it is also bringing in an area in which it is impossible to begin to fixate culture within a particular dimension of knowing. It is something always negotiated. It is something in flux. It is something that has no boundary, so to speak. It is also something that has a politics. It has the politics of the margin, of the marginalized, so to speak. In fact, it was the idea of projecting, the identities of marginalized people, marginalized areas, marginalized interests that activated cultural studies. So we can't say that the synchronicity of looking at culture today has had interventions from fields like Marxism, structuralism, post-structuralism, modernism, postmodernism, has had its own, kinds of psychoanalysis and the like, and it's something that is very, very dynamic. So that literature is affected. Literature today, within the prison of contemporary academia, cannot remain literature as a hermetic thing that you can find just written. It is now something that seems to characterize its social dynamics, just as it started in some oral times, some time back in every culture, where it was characterized with a production within society, something that reflected people and society, something that had to do with spontaneity and also premeditation, something that you could at once find drama as much as music, as much as voicing. So that today, it seems that cultural studies is talking about a whole range of seeing literature as multimodal. For instance, we can talk about the space of slam poetry. Just like we find artists, we can call it an activist called Lee Mokobe, talking about a number of things. Resisting white supremacism in the Western area he has migrated to, specifically in the United States, contested the idea, in his perception anyway, boxing people, necessarily zoning people within what he sees as the boundary of their sexual bodies into another. where he begins to contest the orientation of fixed sex into, a sex that can be crossed. That is a kind of transgender orientation. You can find it. And such slam poems are just as much as literary as we find wonderful, Shakespeare, like Benjamin Zephaniah would say, God bless him, okay? But then that was not his kind of literature. That his literature will rather go with the streets. His literature will go with the voice of the masses. His literature will flow with a kind of hybrid context in which there is the interpenetration of humanity and human beings across zones that are classified as Western or marginal, global South, as the case may be. Now, literature also can be seen within the context. I mean, when doing research in things that have to do with the literary, people can pick up things that have to do with hip-hop as literature, and there have been several researches on that. We can also contend that literature in the prose form may not necessarily be a fiction, may not necessarily be what you call fiction. That you realize prose is not to necessarily affixate fiction on it to make it literary. No, that literature can actually be an autobiography. For instance, we can posit that some autobiographies are, in terms of their language use, their language production and all that, actually literary. It is not the fictional that makes it literary, it is the rhetorical that makes it dictionary. I'm referring to the autobiography of Malala Yousafzai along this context. Malala Yousafzai happened to be one school girl in the Middle East where the Taliban actually shot her, and she escaped death just by a kind of destined chance. She could have died. She became at a point a Nobel Peace Laureate because she was trying to do a number of things in which she spoke for the education of girls, and by extension trying to deal with the part of the Middle East she was coming from, which, because of the governance of the Taliban, made Western education a taboo for the girls. She began to interrogate such situations, and at the point she came up with her autobiography. You know what she called it? She called it I Am Malala. But then the title is not the issue here. What is striking is the literariness of that text. And I can tell you, I Am Malala can be studied as literature. If I remember right, she starts that book in this vein. She starts the book with this line. She says, "My country was created at midnight." Imagine that. My country was created at midnight. Then she continues with a follow-up sentence. She says, "When I will come out, by the time I came out, it was midday." What do you call that? And then she begins to talk about a number of things that the literary seems to predominate the content. So we can pick autobiography, and it's been argued as literature on so many things, like when you talk about the self-narrative of people, for example, that have experienced exile, moving from an embattled, endangered place to going in migrancy, maybe to the West or some other parts of the world, and talking about theirs, you find out that they are also doing a literary thing when you look at the language of some of those spaces. We can also engage things that are, within the area of film. Somehow, if you are in literature, you can take your research in a number of fields, because what matters is that the way you are going to engage it theoretically can give a narrative of what you are doing to be precisely a text affiliated to literature. So literature today, just like theory, has become so multimodal, received multimodally. It is intermedial. It is something that can be realized as a written text. It can be in another mode of writtenness, which is not absolutely in the fictive type. It can be sweet. That's what you can call a literature of Twitter or tweet literature where you interact in conversations, and this is forming a narrative. It's also giving aesthetic dimensions of what people are doing. Do you know that art history has studied just looking at the history of graphic products created by fine artists can be imagined as literature in itself, as having the textuality in which you can penetrate theories like post-structuralism, Marxism, post-colonial discourse, and so on and so forth in. You can even read some productions as gendered, so that today, when we do robust criticism, and if you want to do something very, very engaging, very original, you might be looking beyond the confines of what you see as written literature. You can be looking in the area of your immediate society. What makes this society of boys that are often seen playing musical instrument by the street and saying something, making a story, like we talked about some time back, how Bob Dylan somehow became the Nobel laureate against the grain of people that could have been, just through his musical production, which often told stories. How could that have been? Because this was part of the reality of literature, which has now gained a kind of imaginary that must be fictional or so on and so forth, because there is that element of the rhetorical. The rhetorical, we can say, is in any space where real thinking comes in and real investment of the imaginative comes in. So you can pick your research from any field, anywhere. So far, you are seeing a text in this. So far, it can be argued within the lenses of a textual analysis. So far, it might also be seen as literary, and so far, it engages, robust theoretical penetrations and critical resolutions. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that in the area where you are picking what you want to do your research in, you'll be very dynamic. You can look at it from any angle. Thank you very much. It's nice talking with you again. Remember to subscribe, remember to share it, and remember to make it very public. Thank you very much.